The prairie lay in silence at dusk, broken only by the groan of the wind through brittle grass and the hollow creak of a weathered gate. Thomas Hale moved with slow purpose, his boots dragging faint furrows in the dust as he checked the fence line. The land was his, though it felt more like a burden than a home, acres of soil that never yielded enough, barns too empty, and a house that had grown colder with each year since the grave was dug on the hill. His wife rested there, and the child she could not bring into the world. Every evening, as the light fell red across the ridge, he felt their absence more than the air he breathed. He turned toward the cabin, shoulders stiff beneath a coat patched too many times. That was when he saw her. She stood at the threshold as though the earth had set her there, a woman in tatters, barefoot, dust clinging to her legs like ash. Her braid was half loosed, black strands matted with blood. The shawl of twilight hung around her, but her eyes carried something fiercer than the failing sun, a desperation that had burned past fear. Her chest rose and fell with shallow breaths, yet her voice, when it came, did not waver. "Take me as your wife, or I shall die." The words stilled him where he stood. He felt his hand tighten around the worn handle of the pail he carried, the water within trembling as though struck by her command. It was not a plea, though her lips trembled, it was a sentence, final and sharp as a blade pressed to his throat. Thomas Hale had faced storms, hunger, and the quiet gnaw of grief, but never this. His first thought was to turn her away. The danger of harboring an Apache woman was not small. If her people came for her, they would come for him too, and no fence or rifle could hold against that. And even if they never came, what right had he to bring another into this hollow house where love had already been buried? Yet he did not move to shut the door. He only stared, his jaw locked, the air between them heavy with all the words neither could afford to speak. The wind pressed against the cabin walls, and in it he thought he heard the faint cry of wolves, distant but near enough to be real. She swayed, her knees buckling for the briefest instant, and he saw then the blood seeping through the torn hem of her dress, the dirt caked on her bare feet. Before he could think, his hand was on the doorframe, steadying her as she leaned against it. He pulled her inside with the same grim resolve he used to shoulder every task of survival. The cabin welcomed her with silence. Shadows stretched long across the floor, thrown by a lantern guttering on the table. The smell of wood smoke lingered faintly, though the fire had nearly died. She stood near the hearth, shivering though the night had not yet turned cold. Thomas busied himself at the stove, placing kindling, striking a match. Flames leapt, throwing warmth into the room. When he turned back, she was watching him, not with gratitude, not even suspicion, but with the hollow steadiness of someone who had wagered her life on a single choice. He set bread before her, a rough loaf baked days past, hard at the edges. She tore at it as if she had not eaten in days. He poured water from the tin cup, his own hand shaking though he masked it in silence. Still, he did not ask her name. And she did not give it. Instead, he took his late wife's shawl from the back of the rocker and laid it gently across her shoulders. The fabric still smelled faintly of cedar, though years had passed since it had warmed another body. The sight of it on this stranger struck him like a blow, yet he said nothing. He only lowered himself into the chair across the room, staring into the fire as if it might explain what he had just done. The silence between them deepened. Hers was the silence of exile, of being cast out into a world that had no place for her. His was the silence of grief, of a man who had already buried too much. In that quiet, something bound them, not trust, not yet, but the bare fact of survival. Outside, the wolves cried again, faint and hungry. Inside, the cabin walls held their breath. The morning broke pale and thin, a cold light creeping over the land. Thomas Hale rose before the sun, as he always did, his boots carrying him out to the corral where the frost still clung to the rails. The chores moved through him like habit, each motion worn into his bones, feeding the mare, mending a latch, drawing water from the well. Yet behind him, in the cabin, lingered the weight of a presence that unsettled the air. When he returned, he found her awake, sitting near the hearth as though she had not slept at all. Her eyes, dark and steady, followed the fire as if it carried her thoughts. It was then she spoke her name, Iona. Eternal Blossom. The syllables rolled in the quiet room like a hymn carried from far mountains. She did not offer it gently but as a fact, carved into her being, something that could not be taken from her even if all else had been stripped away. Piece by piece, as the day stretched long, fragments of her story slipped between silences. She had been promised against her will, her spirit traded like a horse between men who thought themselves greater. When she defied them, she was cast out, sent into the wilderness not with honor but with the cruelty of bait. The wolves were meant to finish what her people began. Her hands trembled when she touched the scar along her arm, thin as a whipcord, yet her face did not waver. Hale watched, jaw tight, the ember of anger burning in him though he tried to smother it. He could not fathom how men could condemn their own blood to such an end, yet the thought of raising that anger against her people filled him with equal dread. Retribution was never far on this land, and one Apache woman beneath his roof could summon 100 rifles to his gate. He said little, though she did not ask for more. His silence was not cold but cautious, measured, like a man circling the edge of a canyon too deep to see. As evening settled, he moved about the cabin, putting away tools and mending a harness strap. She followed him with her gaze, not her feet. It was then her eyes caught on the cradle in the corner, half hidden beneath a quilt. Dust had gathered along its curve, but its presence was plain, a small coffin of wood and memory. Hale froze when he saw her looking. For a long moment, neither spoke. His hand drifted unconsciously to the back of the rocking chair, the one that still bore the polish of years of touch though it had not swayed in nearly a decade. Behind it, in a chest near the wall, lay a folded dress of white lace that had not known the sun since the day it was worn. He did not open it, did not speak of it, but the weight of it filled the room as heavily as her scars did. That night, when the fire burned low, Iona whispered words in her own tongue, low and mournful, a melody that seemed to bend the shadows along the walls. Hale did not understand, yet the sound gripped him in a way no language could explain. He thought of the hill beyond the fields, where 2 wooden crosses leaned in the wind. He thought of the shawl now around her shoulders, once wrapped around his wife's. The past, he knew, was never buried. It lived in the grain of the wood, in the scars on skin, in the silence of 2 souls who had lost too much. In that silence, their loneliness reached across the gulf. Different tongues, different worlds, yet the weight they carried was the same. Neither belonged where they came from anymore. Both, in their own way, had been abandoned. The fire sank into embers, throwing a faint red glow against the walls. Outside, the prairie stretched endless and empty, holding their secrets in its dust. Within, 2 castaways sat adrift, not yet tethered to one another, but no longer entirely alone. The sky darkened without warning, clouds dragging their shadows low across the prairie. By late afternoon the horizon was a bruise, heavy and swollen, the kind that promised a storm not in whispers but in roars. Thomas Hale glanced upward as he latched the barn door, his hand lingering on the wood as if by touch alone he could hold back what was coming. The wind picked up, sharp and sudden, rattling the loose shingles on the cabin roof. By the time he stepped inside, Iona was already watching the horizon through the narrow window. Her face bore no fear, only a steady resignation, as if storms were no stranger to her life. He set the bolt on the door, sealing them into the cabin's narrow safety, the walls groaning with each gust. The first crack of thunder shook the ground, rolling through the valley like cannon fire. Rain followed in sheets, striking the earth so hard it seemed the world itself might split. Water seeped through the gaps in the roof, darkening the floorboards. Hale dragged a heavy trunk beneath the dripping, motioning for her to help. Together they shoved it into place, her hands quick, certain, matching his strength with her own. For a moment their breath mingled in the close space, and neither looked away. The storm raged, and so they busied themselves with smaller labors to keep from listening too close to the violence outside. Hale poured grounds into the pot, set it over the fire, and the rich scent of coffee filled the room. He cut slices of cornbread, rough and dry, but it was food enough. She sat cross-legged near the hearth, needle flashing between her fingers as she mended a shirt of his that had long been left in tatters. The rhythm of her work was steady, as though the storm were no more than wind through tall grass. Every crash of thunder sent the cabin trembling, yet she did not flinch. He found himself watching her from the corner of his eye, struck by the way her strength wore no armor. She had been left to wolves, scarred and banished, yet she did not crumble beneath the storm's fury. Instead, she moved through it with the calm of someone who had already endured worse. Lightning split the sky, the flash finding its way through the cracks of the shutters, and for an instant her face glowed with a stark beauty that startled him. Not soft beauty, not the kind that asked for protection, but the beauty of endurance, of earth that still blooms after fire. When the rain pressed harder, threatening the very seams of the roof, Hale climbed onto the chair to shove cloth into the gaps. She steadied the chair with her hands, looking up at him as if she were anchoring more than wood and man. The storm became a mirror of what stirred inside him, violent, unpredictable, and yet, beneath it all, something cleansing. Hours passed in this suspended world, where the land outside drowned and the two within grew bound by necessity. The fire cast their shadows long on the walls, stretching and bending with every gust of wind. Words were scarce, yet silence itself became a kind of speech. When at last the storm waned, thunder rolling farther away, the cabin lay heavy with damp air and the smell of wet earth. They did not open the door. They remained inside, as though afraid the fragile bond built in the storm's heart might scatter if the world rushed in too soon. That night Hale dreamed of his wife. He saw her in the meadow, her hair lit by the morning sun, her laughter breaking the silence as she reached for him. But when he woke, it was not laughter he heard, nor the meadow he smelled. It was the faint smoke of the dying fire, and across the room, the soft rise and fall of Iona's breath. Her braid lay coiled against the pillow, black against the pale cloth, a single thread of life in a house long starved of it. For the first time in years, Hale did not feel entirely alone. The storm left the earth drenched and breathing, the prairie glistening beneath a sky washed clean. For Thomas Hale, life returned to its familiar rhythm, though now it was not a rhythm he moved through alone. Iona stepped into his days as though she had always belonged among the chores. He showed her how to scatter feed for the chickens, how to milk the goats without spilling a drop, how to mend the weak places in the corral. She listened, silent but attentive, her hands learning quickly what his words could not teach. In return, she offered knowledge of her own. When they walked the fields, she gathered sprigs of sage and roots Hale had never thought worth more than weeds. With patient motions she showed him how to dry and bind them, how to boil them into teas that soothed aches and settled the stomach. Her fingers twisted yucca fibers into cords strong enough to lash wood together. It unsettled him, how easily she folded herself into the work, how her presence softened the edges of his solitude without asking leave to do so. And yet the air between them thickened with each passing day. Hale felt the impropriety of it keenly, a woman beneath his roof, not wife, not kin, but something nameless. If word travelled to town, there would be whispers at best, accusations at worst. He knew how neighbors judged what they could not understand. Still, he did not send her away. For Iona, the sting came differently. She worked beside him, ate at his table, slept under his roof, but she remained on the threshold of his acceptance. He had not spoken the word wife since the night she demanded it of him. Shelter was not the same as belonging. She felt it in the way his eyes lingered on her and then turned away, as though even looking too long was a trespass. Their silences grew heavy, filled with what neither dared name. When she bent over the wash-basin, he found himself watching the curve of her braid against her back, and guilt struck him for the thought. When he came in from the fields, sweat darkening his shirt, she stole a glance before lowering her gaze to the floor. A fire smouldered between them, unseen but felt in every glance quickly broken. Above the door, the rifle hung like a watchful sentinel. Hale's gaze often drifted to it, not from habit but from fear. He knew the prairie could carry word farther than he wished. Perhaps her people would come searching, or perhaps riders from town would come with questions he had no answers for. The rifle was both comfort and curse, a reminder of the line between protection and violence. At night the walls of the cabin seemed too close, as though the house itself strained to contain what grew between them. The creak of the rocker in the corner sounded louder than it should, the ticking of the clock sharp as a hammer. He heard her stir on the cot when the wind shifted, and the sound worked into his chest like a thorn. She, too, lay awake, staring at the ceiling beams, wondering if the silence would ever break, if she would ever be more than a shadow in a widower's home. The days carried on, marked by chores and quiet lessons, yet beneath each task lay a thread drawn tauter with every passing hour. Neither reached across it, neither cut it, but both felt how near it was to snapping. Their bond was fragile, unspoken, more dangerous than open conflict. Trust had begun to take root, but yearning, left unanswered, made the soil restless. The prairie wind pressed against the cabin walls, carrying the scent of rain still lingering in the earth. Inside, two souls moved around each other carefully, as if afraid a single misstep might bring the whole fragile house of silence down upon them. The days stretched long, their silence no longer a shield but a weight pressing heavier with each sunset. It was evening when the air finally broke between them. The light outside dimmed, the prairie turning to ash, while within the cabin the fire hissed and popped, casting gold upon the walls. Hale sat at the table, his hands rough against the grain of the wood, his gaze fixed on the rifle above the door as though the answer to every question might be found in steel. Iona sat near the hearth, mending a torn sleeve, her fingers steady though her eyes seemed far away. He spoke her name. She looked up, and in that small motion he felt his throat tighten. The words came slowly, dragged from a place he had kept locked for too long. That night, when you stood in my doorway, why did you say it? Why call yourself my wife? The question hung between them, stark as the wind rattling the shutters. For a long moment she did not move, her needle paused mid-stitch. Then she set the cloth aside and turned toward him fully. The fire caught the sharp lines of her face, softened them, and in her eyes there was no plea, only truth. "A woman alone has no name," she said quietly. "No safety, no place in the world. I was cast out, left for wolves. To speak that word, wife, was to choose life, not death. If I had not spoken it, I would have vanished from this earth before the moon rose again." Her voice did not tremble. It carried the weight of something more than survival. "But since I have been here, beneath your roof, I have known something I never knew before. Quiet. Peace. No one has asked me to bow, to give what I do not choose. In this place, I have breathed as though I belonged to myself." Hale's hands clenched against the table, the grain biting into his skin. He had not thought of himself as offering peace, only shelter. Yet to hear her say it stirred something inside him he had thought long dead. He rose slowly, moving to stand near the fire where she sat today. The glow lit his face, deepening the lines carved there by grief. "I buried my wife 10 years past," he said, the words gravel in his throat. "Her and the child that never drew breath. Since then I felt nothing but the cold of an empty bed, the sound of my own steps in a house too quiet. You sit here now, and it terrifies me. I have not felt another soul close in so long, I scarcely know how to let it be." Their eyes met, and neither looked away. The silence that followed was not the silence of avoidance but of confession, a truth too large for words. The fire crackled between them, throwing sparks upward like fleeting stars. Hale reached for the sleeve she had been mending, his fingers brushing hers as he took it. The contact was brief, almost accidental, yet it carried the weight of all that had been unsaid. She did not pull back. Instead, her hand remained near his, their closeness more binding than any vow. No promises were spoken, no declarations made. The bond formed there was quieter, forged not in passion's rush but in the raw ache of survival, of two broken lives daring to knit themselves together. The fire warmed their faces, their hands, and something deeper still. That night, as the wind eased and the prairie lay hushed, they sat long by the hearth, saying little, their silence carrying more than words ever could. When at last they parted for sleep, the house no longer felt so hollow. The fire on the hearth had burned low, but within both of them, a new flame had taken hold, fragile, trembling, yet alive. The morning carried a stillness that felt too heavy, the kind that presses before something breaks. Hale was mending a fence rail when he saw them, shapes gathering on the horizon, the glint of sun on horse tack, the rise of dust beneath hooves. Riders. He dropped the hammer, his chest tightening as he counted them. Not neighbors. Not drifters. The cut of their hair, the paint on their ponies, Iona's people. He strode back to the cabin, the weight of the rifle already in his hands. Iona was at the table, grinding roots in a stone bowl. She looked up, saw his face, and understood before he spoke. Her gaze moved past him, out the window, toward the growing line of riders. No fear showed in her eyes, only a steady fire that made his grip on the rifle falter. "They've come," he said, voice rough. She rose without hesitation. "They have not come for you," she answered. "They have come for me." Hale moved to block the door. "You step outside, they'll take you. Or worse." But she laid her hand on the barrel of the rifle, pushing it gently downward. "No gun can give me what I must take for myself." The riders drew near, their horses stamping the earth, their faces carved from stone and memory. The leader dismounted, his voice cutting sharp through the wind. He called her name, demanded her return, declared that she had shamed them with her defiance. His words burned with threat, yet she did not shrink. She stepped forward, her shoulders squared, the shawl still draped around her like a mantle. "I was left for wolves," she said, her voice ringing clear. "I was cast away. Now I choose for myself. My life is mine. My dignity is mine. My husband is mine." The word hung in the air like a struck bell. Husband. She spoke it with a certainty that no decree could undo. Behind her, Hale stood silent, rifle heavy in his hand, yet in that moment he saw the power in her that no weapon could match. The warriors shifted uneasily. Some looked to one another, uncertain. They had come expecting to find a captive, a broken woman hidden in a settler's house. Instead they found one who stood unbroken, her choice cutting sharper than any blade. The leader's mouth twisted, but no challenge left it. He mounted his horse again, leaving only a warning. Her path was her own now, but the eyes of her people would not forget. Then they turned and rode away, dust swallowing them as swiftly as they had come. Silence returned, heavier than before. Hale let the rifle slip back into its place above the door. Iona stood rooted, her breath slow, as though she had just wrestled a storm to stillness. When she turned to him, something unspoken passed between them, not relief alone, but the knowledge that what had bound them in silence had now been declared to the world. That afternoon they saddled the mare. The prairie stretched wide, the sky washed clean by the storm days before. Hale led her to the hill beyond the fields, where 2 wooden crosses leaned in the wind. He removed his hat, the brim pressed against his chest, his gaze fixed on the names carved faintly into the wood. Iona knelt, laying wildflowers at the base of the graves, yellow blooms gathered from the meadow. She touched the earth gently, as though honoring not only the dead, but the woman whose shawl still warmed her shoulders. Hale's throat tightened. He had not brought anyone to this place since the day he dug the soil with his own hands. To stand here now, not alone, was both wound and balm. The silence stretched, but it was no longer hollow. It was reverent. When they rode back down the hill, the light slanted gold across the land, touching the cabin with a glow it had not known in years. They did not ride as strangers bound by circumstance, but as companions who had chosen one another against every force that had sought to break them. The prairie wind moved around them, carrying no judgment, only the sound of hooves steady on the earth. They returned home together.